So this forum was held at NYU School of Law and it runs for over 70 minutes. But you should know before watching the full video that at times this is excruciatingly difficult to listen to. Excruciating because the problem glasses wearing SJW seated next to Jonathan Haidt goes for gold in the Oppression Olympic Stakes. Before we start, the guy in the middle is the moderator. The two to his right are law professors, the woman is from Harvard, and the man from NYU. On the other, we have Jonathan Haidt, and next to him, the turbocharged SJW.
So I think, particularly when we're talking about being in the classroom and making sure that this is a safe environment for all students, one thing that comes up really often is this idea of content warnings. And the reason that I like bringing up the Americans with Disabilities Act is that, to me, content warnings are all about access. So I think of them as sort of collective reasonable accommodations. If you think about the purpose of the Americans with Disabilities Act, it is to make sure that people with disabilities have the same ability to participate and access to the same things that people who don't have disabilities do. And that's sort of the same idea behind content warning.
Nothing like a good false equivalency to start us off. She's comparing content or trigger warnings to providing access for disabled people. So some people are so marginalized in the classroom, they're equivalent to the disabled. Of course, this is just the now standard, tried and true method of establishing a victim narrative.
If you think about the way our society is organized, it's in an ableist way. It's to privilege people without disabilities, people who don't need these kinds of accommodations. And that's sort of an arbitrary choice. Like, why did we decide to organize our society that way?
But it's not an arbitrary choice. It's the most efficient choice. And that's not to say that things don't or can't be improved over time. But if every apartment block that had more than one floor had to have an elevator, that would be prohibitively expensive. The idea that we would make the world over for everyone with any type of disability is not practical.
If we think about things like sidewalks, for example, like, why are curbs elevated? We've added ramps in order to make sure that people with wheelchairs can access sidewalks. And those benefits all kinds of people, people with their groceries, people with strollers.
And why do streets have gutters? Have you heard of rain? Drainage?
So content warnings in the classroom, they're really similar. They don't just benefit people who might be triggered or traumatized by content, but also sort of everybody by sort of setting an idea that this will be a safe space for this conversation. It signals to those who might not have those experiences, hey, this is an area where I maybe need to take a second look to be a good ally, to be a good peer. And I think that it's also really important to think about when we say things like, oh, those are inconvenient, or why should I have to do this? Why should I have to change the way that I teach? I feel like we're making people from marginalized communities invisible, and we're pretending that they're not there.
This is a classic case of catastrophizing, or viewing something as much worse than it actually is. The idea that not providing trigger warnings is akin to treating marginalized people as though they are invisible is patently absurd. How marginalized are you if you're a law student at New York University?
Why should we have to wait for someone who has experienced sexual violence to come forward and ask for a content warning when we know that 1 in 4 women in college will go through this?
Now you've lost all credibility, repeating the 1 in 4 women will experience sexual assault myth that, as Christina Hoff Sommers has pointed out,
it's very hard to study topics like rape and sexual assault. The best that we have, it's not perfect, but the best we have comes from the Justice Department, its Bureau of Justice Statistics. And it has found that approximately 1 in 53 women will be victims of rape or sexual assault in college. That's still too many victims, but it's vastly different from 1 in 4. And according to the latest FBI data, U.S. rape rates have been in sharp decline for decades.
But hey, whatever feeds the narrative.
When we refuse to affirmatively do these things, to affirmatively make our classrooms safer for people, we're pretending that people from marginalized communities are invisible and that they're not there. And I think that that's a problem.
This should go without saying, but if you think a classroom should be a safe space, you're not ready for university. If you mean safe from physical harm, then sure, but that's not what she or others of her ilk mean. They want to be safe from opinions and even ideas that are potentially triggering.
Okay. Anybody want to comment on this? Yes, John.
I'd be happy to. So I think it's helpful to take the accommodationist perspective, and we certainly all want people to feel that the classroom is open to them. We don't want people coming to the classroom and being afraid. But first, I would question, is there any evidence or reason to think that giving content warnings or trigger warnings actually will do this? As a psychologist, I've been looking into this, and the more you label things as potentially threatening, the more they develop a certain power to actually threaten. So think about it this way. I teach classes in the business school here. Suppose I took my students on field trips all over New York. But every time we went to the Bronx, I said, now, today, we're going to the Bronx. Just want to let you know, we'll have an ambulance with us, we'll have police protection, but don't worry about it, we're going to the Bronx. And I only do that for the Bronx. What are people going to conclude about the Bronx? Now, if there was evidence that these warnings actually helped people get over PTSD, then we'd have to balance various things. But there isn't, and the therapists that I talked to, the people who study PTSD, were unanimous in saying that if someone has PTSD, the last thing you want to do is shield them from small reminders. In fact, the only way to get over the Pavlovianly conditioned fear is to let them be exposed to small things, and then nothing bad happens to them, and that's how the fear subsides. So I'm totally fine with being really explicit on the syllabus. We're going to cover these things. Of course, let people know before they join. But if in the course of daily teaching you say, we're about to look at something that shows this, that, or the other thing, content warning, you're actually hurting the very people you want to help.
So Haidt delivers the evidence-based argument that trigger warnings go against best psychological practice, and there's absolutely no evidence to suggest trigger warnings have the desired effect. All they do is make people even more hypersensitive. And if people have forgotten what a syllabus or a course outline is for, I've had to collaborate in writing these myself, not for law school, but I assume if you're taking criminal law, in the outline they'll tell you the topics to be covered: homicide, rape. And if you're a law student taking criminal law, how could you be oblivious to these topics being part of your course? Does the student have any responsibility to prepare themselves at all?
Can I
Of course.
respond to that? So, I mean, first, I don't understand how the warning about the Bronx could be the kind of thing that we're talking about. I actually think that that's probably a really problematic thing to say to your students.
Yeah, it would be. That's right.
And I don't think that there's anybody who's been requesting that, that these are the kinds of things that we're talking about.
So she has a problem with Haidt's hypothetical example, which is used to illustrate a point, but she clearly can't make that leap in her mind, objecting to it because no one has specifically asked for it. But she has no problem in talking about marginalized people as invisible in the classroom because they didn't get a trigger warning.
I take issue with this idea that, you're helping students by not giving them a content warning. If you think about this sort of, that's what you're talking about is therapy. It's a treatment that happens in a therapeutic setting, and I don't think that it's up to a professor to tell someone that what's best for them in their treatment and wherever they are in their development.
What a vapid statement. A law professor may not know what the best therapeutic practice is, but neither does the student. There's an implicit assumption here that the student knows best, that whatever a student feels they need has to be accommodated. What an unbelievable sense of entitlement.
To listen to something.
Can I just ask a question? I mean, the normal model of an accommodation is somebody notifies you that they need an accommodation, they describe it, And if it's a medically required accommodation, then the Americans with Disabilities Act requires you to do something about it. But you're talking about something slightly different, right? You're talking about, as it were, anticipating that there might be a need for an accommodation in every class. Is that right? In every class where any topic that might produce this. Why isn't it a better model just to get people to ask
Well,
for
I
accommodation?
think that we need to shift the burden from people from marginalized communities and forcing them to sort of come forward in the way that we know will stigmatize them, in a way that we know like puts them in harm's way or makes them have to be vulnerable when we already know what their needs are. And this is a situation is the system is made to benefit people who have privilege in our society.
The expression on Haidt's face really says it all. She's hitting all the buzzwords now. Marginalised communities. Societies set up for those with privilege. What Problem Glasses wants to do is shift the burden for preparing yourself to tackle difficult subjects onto the teacher, so that the students are sheltered from making any adjustments themselves. Again, going against best practice for dealing with trauma. And it's ultimately a request to keep themselves in an infantilized state. So I'm going to skip ahead here to Haidt's explanation of what he calls moral dependency.
So I think what we're seeing here, and what I've seen a lot in the last 6 months, is a gigantic generational divide. Anthony started this section by talking about how civility does not mean that
I'm of the very, very old generation, in case you're wondering.
Born before or after 1980 is the key.
Yes.
Those born before 1980 generally think, as Jeremy just said, you're here to learn to come to terms with ideas that might be upsetting, disconcerting. Anthony said civility means, of course, you shouldn't be insulting and you shouldn't be afraid of being attacked, but you don't have a right to expect that you won't encounter. So this is the view of most people born before 1980. This is more the classic liberal tradition. This is John Stuart Mill. We know that we are imperfect. We know that we are biased and prone to post hoc reasoning. We need opposition to help us learn, to help us grow. We need that. Now, what happened in America after 1980, we had a string of child murders and abductions. We had cable TV. We had milk cartons. We had a real crime wave, too. American child-rearing norms changed radically in the early 80s. And so kids born after that had much, much less time unsupervised. Kids born before then had a lot of time in their childhood unsupervised. If they got into trouble with each other, someone calls you a stupid idiot, you either call them a stupid idiot back or you punch them. But for those born after 1980, in general, there's always an adult around, always an authority that you go to. And so what we're seeing much more since 2000 or so is that undergraduates in particular come out of high school where they've been protected, where they have never had, there's zero tolerance for bullying, which is a good thing, but there's what's called moral dependency. People born after 1980 are much more likely to be in a state of moral dependency. If somebody has done something to me, I won't deal with it myself. I will get an adult authority, a bureaucratic authority, the diversity department, something to punish the person who did this to me. And this makes it impossible to teach. This makes it impossible to have an intellectual community because everybody's afraid. If I say something wrong, somebody in the class is going to call in a drone strike on me.
And this is the same argument Haidt outlined in the Sam Harris podcast that I shared in a previous video. This moral dependency, as Haidt calls it, explains the punitive reaction students have whenever they don't like something. They call on the authorities to punish those that they feel have transgressed against them.
I think Viviana and Jeannie both, and maybe even Jeremy, those of us from the remote generations, have something to say about this. Viviana and then Jeannie.
Okay. So I think that it's really important to make a distinction between instances of discomfort and systemic oppression. So when we're talking about systemic oppression, we're talking about when society's laws, customs, practices are all set up in a way to discriminate and treat unjustly a certain group of people. Instances of discomfort is a time when, like, my feelings were hurt. But the thing that was said to me or what was done to me isn't something that reinforces systemic oppression. These are two different things. And I think that it's important to realize that despite the fact that I feel like the other side is sort of co-opting this idea of being offended and oppressed, it isn't true. Only people who have been systemically oppressed can sort of make that claim in a way that it's, reflective of injustice in our society.
And of course, social justice always has to come down to this: special privileges for specific groups. If you're not a victim of systemic oppression, you're not a real victim. You have to know your place in the oppression stack. This is just another way of saying, shut up, Whitey. The oppressed people are talking, and you're not allowed to have an opinion. Now, nowhere in this discussion does she ever name or specify any systems of oppression, because you don't have to if you're a social justice warrior. You just assert truths and then argue on that basis, instead of establishing truths based on evidence.
As far as the institutional racism, all I would ask you to consider, you can believe what you want, but I would ask you to consider this. Shouting institutional racism does not actually combat racism. You have to find individual instances, and you have to show me who the racists are so that we can fight them together. I hate racism. I think it's evil. But if you're just going to say institutional racism every time something bad happens, there's no way to fight it. I need a policy that you're proposing, or I need a person who's actually racist so that we can fight it together, or we can determine whether the policy is good. What I find really problematic is the virtue signaling that I see by so many people on the other side, which is, I don't have to give you the racist, I don't have to tell you who he is or what measures I'm proposing. I just say institutional racism, everybody cheers for me because that's an approved point of view, and now we move on with our lives. You haven't helped anybody, you've just made yourself feel better.
And this is the best response to charges of systemic oppression, or in this case, institutionalized racism, that I've seen. Demand they get specific. Don't just accept slogans shouted at you. But let's get back to problem glasses.
And I think the importance of bringing that up is because what you're sort of talking about, and I feel like the attempt is to make us, students who are asking for these accommodations, students who are asking for accountability, seem weak. And I resent that. I don't think that it is a weakness to aspire for a society where we don't hurt each other. And I think that what we're talking about is impact and accountability for that impact. In fact, in our own safe spaces, we talk about, assuming best intentions, but also owning your impact.
So she rejects the idea that asking for accommodations is a sign of weakness, and then goes on to talk about the discussions they have in their safe spaces. The mental gymnastics it takes to make such statements is staggering. And she aspires to a society where we don't hurt each other. But again, she's not talking about physical harm. She's talking about hurting people's feelings. You are a poster child for weakness.
And I think that what we're asking of our professors, of our universities, of the classroom space is that people do this, that they own their impact, that if they said something that reinforces our unjust society, the way it's set up, something that it, reflects systemic oppression, that impact is owned, that person is accountable for what they've said. And I think that actually encourages free speech, and it encourages this discourse, and it just makes it accessible for everyone. We're talking about, in reality, this debate isn't about free speech. It's about how do we make sure that voices that have been silenced are actually listened to now. We are here, we're demanding that we be treated fairly, that we not be treated unjustly, and we're letting you know these are the ways in which you've systemically hurt me.
The idea that people must monitor and be accountable to anyone that feels aggrieved by anything said in a classroom will encourage free speech is a complete inversion of reality. It's going to make people self-censor because it's not worth it to express an opinion.
But I'm sorry, but the click, this happened. So if we go back to the 1970s, the military and the military had terrible race problems. It was an extremely racist place. Corporations had a lot of sexism, racism problems. And universities, I presume, were better places than to be in the military. Universities are very progressive, very concerned about race and gender issues, about oppression, marginalization issues. Over the 30 years after that, the Army has very largely solved its racism problem. It's a much more equal place, much higher satisfaction among black sergeants and black officers. So they've made a lot of progress. Corporate America has made a lot of progress. But as far as I can tell, many people are saying that the universities have not made progress or are getting worse. And this is what I don't understand. So you're saying that that universities such as NYU are so systemically racist and oppressive that these means are necessary to hold the professors accountable. So can you just explain, what do you mean when you say that these places are so racist and oppressive? These universities have been trying really hard for a long time. What is it that they haven't done?
So I think, I mean, it's sort of undeniable that, these institutions were not built for us. And when I say for us, I'm thinking broadly about members of marginalized communities,
That's fine.
people who are low income, people of color, LGBTQIA people, people with disabilities. These institutions were sort of built in a way to perpetuate systems that are racist. This is undeniable. And what I'm saying is that there's a difference between saying like, oh, hey, it's great that you're here. I'm going to put you on my pamphlet and show everybody how diverse I am, and actually making sure that the classroom is a safe place for me, a place where I have the same opportunity as students who have privilege to just sit there and be able to learn and not have to be fending off constantly all of these sort of, like violent acts that are thrown my way. And
Violent? Is there violence?
I mean, I think that violence is not just limited to sort of physical things.
Right.
Right. And I thought that you would take issue with that notion.
That's called concept creep.
Just a string of incoherent bullshit. So racism existed when universities were built. Okay. But she still hasn't addressed the question. How do universities perpetuate systemic oppression today? The idea that if you're gay, you're not welcome to study at university, that you'll be silenced from participating, is just ludicrous. And of course, she now has to catastrophize this non-oppression into violence, which as Haidt correctly identifies as concept creep. So forget the buzzwords and the feel-good messages. The underlying rationale for these accommodations, or more accurately, demands, is always the same. Because feelings. The world must be made over to suit my subjective interpretations of my own experiences. The idea that a university should be a safe space undermines the very purpose of its existence.